Now let's go for a final test. You can see that we have all our entities here. We just put the prefabs, and by default we have all instantiated 4 copies of each. And now when we hit play, instead of instantiating a new entity, we just select one of those and set it to true. And when we collect it, or when it goes off out of the camera, it just sets to false. This way we are not instantiating any new entity during gameplay, we are just recycling them, saving a lot of performance and making everything a lot more efficient, which is really important for mobile games. Hi, I'm Ricky. Today we're on the 37th episode of the Anderson series, and today we see how to make an object pooling system. And I know that optimizing a game isn't really that exciting, but if you're making a mobile game, optimizing is a big part of it. And object pooling is usually the first step and also the most important. Before we start, remember that you can also download the entire project from GitHub for free, and you can also follow me on Twitter to get any updates on whatever video I'm currently working on. Right now, I'm also developing a new game for PC. It's called AA, all links in the description. Alright, so let's start. To make our object pooling system, we're gonna make a new anti-game object in our scene. The main thing that we instantiate and destroy in our game are entities, so treasures and enemies. So I'm gonna call our object pooling system Entities Magazine. An object pooling system has 2 main functions, one to request an entity and one to put back an entity into the magazine. We're not going to implement these functions just yet, that's just to show you the main structure of the script. The first thing that we actually need is to define the entities in our magazine. Right now, in our other script called GameObjects, we have an array of GameObjects, and each of those GameObjects has an entity type script, and that's what we define as entities. In here, we want a bit more to work with, so instead of just making an array of GameObjects, we're going to make a new subclass that defines what an entity in magazine is. And then in our entities magazine, we make an array of this. Now, an entity magazine is defined by 3 things. First, we need a GameObject prefab to actually instantiate whatever we want to make. And that's going to be much like in our GameObjects, where we have an entity prefab that we have instantiate. That's just basically the same thing. Then we want a list of GameObjects. That's going to be all the entities that we've instantiated through this prefab. And make sure to add the System Collections generic library. Finally, we want an entity type that defines the identifier of this entity in magazine. We could use getComponent into our entity prefab, get the entity type script, and get the entity type enum, but it's a lot better, it's a lot more efficient if we just put that value inside our entity magazine. Finally, because we want to see this array in our inspector, we also want to serialize this class. You can use system.serializable or add the using system library. Let me also put a quick return null in here, so just that the script compiles and we can see it in Unity. Here we have our array of entities in magazine. I'm gonna set it to 2. And here we have our values. I set the booty and outpost prefabs, which are just the exact same as the ones that we have in our game manager, in our GameObjects. They are the same GameObjects. Now we also have the entity spawned and the entity ID, but they are serialized just for debugging. We don't actually need to change them through the inspector. Let's go back to the script, and now we need a way to initialize those entities in magazine. So let's add an awake function. And for each of the entities in magazine, we want to do 2 things. The first is to set the entity ID, so that we don't have to do it through the inspector. The second thing is to instantiate some entities from the prefab. How many entities we want to instantiate on awake depends on how many entities at the same time can be found in our game. In this case, in our endless runner, we only ever have 3, maybe 4 entities at the same time. So it doesn't make sense to instantiate 5 entities, because we can maybe have only 4 rocks at the same time on screen. We only need to instantiate 4 rocks and then recycle them. So I made a very quick for loop that activates 4 times, and now we instantiate 4 times the entity's prefab. We don't need to worry about position and rotation because we're going to turn it off by default. And finally, we put the entity that we just spawned into the entities magazine. And that's it. Now we have initialized our array of entities magazine. Let's see how it looks in Unity. You see that the second entity, the second element, turns its entity ID to reflect the one in the prefab. And we also spawned for each element 4 copies. And they are already present here in our scene, but they're set to false. So they don't actually interfere with our gameplay. Alright, so that's it for the initialization. Now let's implement these 2 functions. When we request an entity, we want to search into the right magazine and return one of the entities spawned. So first, to search into an array, we're going to use array.find. And for the parameter of the entity ID, we're going to add a parameter to our function. And to use array, remember to add the system library. And because we're using the system library, we can actually delete this. Now through array.find, we're going to find the right magazine with the right entity ID. I also want to check whether that magazine actually exists. If you don't find the right magazine, it means that it doesn't exist. And if so, it means that we have forgotten to set it up. So I'm returning null and also throwing a debug log error. If you do find the right magazine, we also want to check whether there are any entities available. So we just check whether entity spawn.count is major than 0. If it's major than 0, then we go forward. But if it is 0, then we need to fill it. We need to instantiate a new entity. Now to instantiate an entity into a magazine, we have already done that here. So let's make a new function that encapsulates this bit of code. I also need to pass in as a parameter the magazine into which spawn an entity. And now we can call this function in here. Okay, so this way, if we come here with our code, we know that we found the right magazine, we know that the magazine has at least one entity available. Now we just need to take one entity from the magazine, set it to true, and return it. So we select the first element in the list of entity spawn, then we set it to true, reset the rotation. We don't care about the position because when we instantiate something, we almost always set the position to somewhere important, so we don't care about resetting it here too. Our rotation is not so common, so may want to do it here. And then we remove the GameObject that we selected from the list, and finally we return it. So we need to go in every script that instantiate an entity, and instead of instantiating them, we call this object magazine. So let's go in our GetMob manager, and this is where we instantiate GameObjects, as you can see from the entities prefabs that we have here. Now in here we have a function called getMob, which returns to the spawn manager an entity that is to be spawned. So instead of an array of GameObjects, let's put an array of entity types. We can replace the how my name is unlocked max here with no problem. And now in here, in our getMob, instead of returning the prefab directly, because we don't have those anymore, let's call the entities magazine. And we need a reference, so let's go back and make a singleton. Alright. In here, it's where we select the treasure in our game, which is the element 0. So instead of returning entities prefab 0, we select the entities ID element 0. And this is gonna return a game object, so we just return that. And that's it for the booty. I'm also gonna add a comment. We could have also used the entity types directly, like this, because this is a very specific entity to return. But just to make things look a bit more like they used to, I'm gonna use the element 0. That's also because where we select instead an enemy, we start from the position 1, and it makes sense if we see the position 0 here. Alright, so for the second part of getMob, we create an empty GameObject, the entity to choose, and then we cycle through them to see if we get one that is right. Instead, let's use an entity type. So instead of prefabs, we use the IDs, and that's fine. Now, entity type, we don't need to. We can delete it. We can replace this. Unlock achievement. And finally, instead of returning the ID directly, we call the object magazine just like we did here. Also, it looks a lot cleaner now, which is always better. And we also deleted a getComponent function, which is not very performant. Alright, now this function, however, is highly tied with the spawn manager. So let's go ahead and open the spawn manager. And in here you can see that we're actually using the GameOb manager to not get an actual GameObject, but a reference that we then instantiate here right after. Instead, because the GameObject is already spawned and active when we get it through the GetMob manager, we just take the position and that's it. Also, because this is the actual spawned entity, let's also change the name. And there are a lot more things that we could change in here to make them more performant, but one thing at a time. We're gonna see more optimization in another episode about it. For now, let's go back to Unity. Let's go in our object pooling and let's set up all the entities. And then let's go to our game manager, GetMob manager, and now we need to set up the IDs. And make sure you do not put stuff like tentacles. We don't want the sub-entities, we just want the main ones. Tentacle is a sub-entity of octopus, so we don't want to instantiate it. Let's hit play. Here we have all our entities spawned already. And now instead of instantiating some new entities, these ones are just gonna turn to true. And if you look at our object pooling, you can see that they are slowly diminishing, and eventually they're gonna turn to 0 and they're gonna instantiate new entities. That's because we aren't recycling them already. So let's close that off, and back in our entities magazine, now we need to implement put entity into magazine. This is very similar to request entity. The first thing I want to do is check for the right magazine, so we can just copy this bit of code. And again, we could use getComponent to get the entity type, but because we're gonna call put entity into magazine from entity types, we're gonna already have a reference to it. So instead, let's just add a parameter to the entity ID. You're gonna see what I mean later. And we also don't wanna return null because it's a void function. And then we've got the right magazine. We just need to basically do the inverse of this. And that's it. Much simpler, this one. And we actually don't want to change anything else in our script except for our entity magazine, where we may want to add hiding inspector. Because we shouldn't mess with these values in the inspector, but we need them to be public, it's better if you put hiding inspector. This way we don't accidentally touch them. Alright, now to actually call this function, I'd say we're gonna do it in our entity types, so let's go in there. And in here we already have a way to call that function. We had this virtual onHitFinishLine function that is called when the entity goes out of the screen. So in here, let's just put the entity back into the magazine. And as you can see, we can put the entity type parameter because we already have a value for it in here. One thing though, we also need to check whether the entity that is calling this function isn't a sub-entity like the tentacle. Only the parent entity, so the octopus, should call this function. Now let's be wary though, because this function is virtual, and that means that the script that inherits from entity type could change how onHitFinishLine works. So let's open all the scripts that inherit entity types one by one. Let's start with booty. In here we are overriding onHitFinishLine to do things that regard the player's money. Before we do that, let's call the base function. Great, now we just need to do this same thing for all the other scripts. We don't have a script for rock, so we're good. We do have a script for octopus though, so let's go ahead and open it. In here, we're not overriding on hit finish line, so we're good. The next one is Orca, so let's open Orca. Inside Orca, we have start entity, we have move, update, change direction, but we are not overriding on hit finish line, so we're also good here. Let's go to Whirlwind, and in Whirlwind, we are overriding on hit finish line, so we need to call the base function. Very good. Now let's open finish line, which is the script that actually calls on hit finish line. And in here you see that when the finish line, which is the low bar where the entities go, the finish line is calling on a hit finish line, which is just what we want, but it's also destroying the game object. Because we are not gonna destroy them anymore, we can remove this. Alright, so now we have a way to activate and deactivate the entities. We also need a way to reset them. Right now in our entities magazine, when we put an entity back, we just set it to false, and then we set it to true and we reset the rotation. We also may want to change other things. For example, let's go back to our octopus script. In here we are overriding start entity to also choose a tentacle, which basically takes one of the two tentacles and sets it to true. Now that's fine if you just instantiate the octopus and destroy it later on, but if you want to recycle the octopus, you want to call this function every time we start entity, but you also want to make sure that only one tentacle at a time is active. So before we choose a tentacle, let's also disable all tentacles. We need to do the same things for scripts that somehow change during their gameplay. So in Booty, we don't need to do anything. In Whirlwind, we're also not doing anything that we need to change during gameplay. Octopus entity we just did. We don't have a script for rock, so we don't have to worry about that. The only thing that is left is the Orca. In the Orca script, in the start entity, we're setting a speed, and that's fine. But we're also inverting the direction and inverting the sprite renderer's flip on the X randomly. We need to set those to default whenever we start the entity. So by default, X direction is 1. So here on start entity, let's also set it to 1. We also want to set the sprite renderer's flip X to its default value on start. So let's go to Unity. Let's take a look at the Orca. And let's see. By default, its flip, it's set to false. So also in here, we're gonna set it to false. This way, whenever we call start entity, the whole entity is gonna reset, and you don't have to worry about it. It's as if we've just instantiated a new copy of it. One final thing that you may want to check is the boat's collision, because we're also destroying entities when the player hits them. Let's go into boat player, boat collision. In here, on trigger enter 2D, when we collide with an entity, we register it, and we check for its entity type. And if it is a booty, you can see that we destroy it. Instead, let's put it back into the magazine. Ideally, we may also want to make a separate function, one that is called onHitPlayer, and put it into the entity type, and for each entity have something different, like play a different sound, have a different function, play a different animation, stuff like that. But we're not doing any of that for now, so let's just call it manually from here. Now, if the entity that we hit isn't a booty, we go in here, and this looks a bit hideous, I'm not gonna lie. This is one of the first scripts that we made, so it's okay that it looks a bit bad now. That just means that we as a programmer have improved in the meantime. Now in here we check whether the entity is an animal, and that has to do with the nets. And if it is an animal and it is an octopus, we need to check whether it's not actually a tentacle, because if it is a tentacle, we actually want to destroy the parent. There's a lot of stuff here that we could change. For now, let's just worry about replacing everything that has to do with destroy with entities magazine. So in here, much like before, we just put the entities back and we set the collision game object, and we get the entity type from the entity type that we've collided with. And we can remove this. And here we want to do the same, but we need to check for the parent game object. So instead of collision.gameObject, we use collision.gameObject transform parent, because that's the octopus .gameObject. And that's the entity type. We don't want the entity type of the tentacle, we want the entity type of its parent, which is the octopus. Again, having a separate function called something like onHitPlayer will be much simpler, but we're not going to see that today. Alright, so we put out those destroy, and that should be it. Let's go to Unity, and let's go for a final test. You can see that we have all our entities here. We just put the prefabs, and by default, we have all instantiated 4 copies of each. And now when we hit play, instead of instantiating a new entity, we just select one of those and set it to true. And when we collect it, or when it goes off out of the camera, it just sets to false. This way, we are not instantiating any new entity during gameplay, we are just recycling them, saving a lot of performance and making everything a lot more efficient. This way, we don't have any big memory leaks, which is really important for mobile games. Alright, so that's it for this video. Hope you learned something new. If you have any doubts about the code or any suggestion you'd like to see in the next video, do tell me in the comments. If you're having some real issues, you can always download the entire project from GitHub, or you can join my Discord channel and ask me some questions directly. Remember to like, subscribe, share the video, ring the notification bell, follow me on Twitter and everything, all of that stuff, and I'll see you next time. See ya!